I was forced to dress as a woman to serve. If you are listening to this late at night, with the room quiet and your phone light cutting through the dark, do not scroll away yet. What you are about to hear is not a rumor dressed up as entertainment. It is a pattern. It is a system. And once you see its shape, it is difficult to unsee. To the public, Yu Menglong was a polished image, a rising star with a practiced smile, a performer who looked as if nothing could reach him. But the sentence that detonated across social media did not sound like a publicity stunt. It sounded like someone describing the moment they realized they were no longer a person. They were a possession. The words spread with the speed of a fire finding dry timber. A short video, under 3 minutes, shared again and again, not because it was cinematic, because it was specific, because it was humiliating in a way that did not feel invented, and because humiliation, when it is forced, rarely belongs to a single moment. It belongs to a design. According to the witness who first stepped into the light, the act was not a joke. It was not fashion. It was not a prank between colleagues. It was an obedience test, the kind that does not merely embarrass you. It reshapes you. It teaches your nervous system a new law. Someone else decides what you do, what you wear, how you move, when you speak, and when you stop being human in the eyes of the people who own your future. We should be careful here, because this story, as it is told online, arrives wrapped in outrage, hashtags, and speculation. Yet even within that noise, certain details repeat with a disturbing consistency. The witness described strict monitoring, the kind of monitoring that does not end when the camera turns off. Messages checked, schedules controlled, interactions watched, mistakes punished, not simply with criticism, but with consequences designed to isolate and break. And then there is the key detail that makes the stomach tighten. Dressing as a woman, the witness said, was only one mechanism. The purpose was not the clothing. The purpose was submission, a daily reminder that the people with authority could reach into your identity and rearrange it for their own satisfaction. In that world, humiliation is not an accident. It is policy. As the clip went viral, discussions erupted across Weibo, X, and TikTok. The hashtags multiplied. Some demanded justice. Some demanded proof. Some demanded names. And that is when the story began to shift from a single confession to something larger and more dangerous. Because once a public figure becomes the center of an allegation like this, the gravitational pull brings others into view. Anonymous staffers, former trainees, insiders speaking in fragments. People who claim they watched the same mechanisms used on others, in other rooms, under other pretexts. A picture begins to form, not of a scandal, but of a hierarchy. A workplace that behaves like a closed ecosystem. A structure that rewards obedience and punishes questions. We have seen this pattern in other industries. Not always with the same surface details, but with the same core logic. Power concentrated in a small circle. Careers treated like leashes. Control disguised as discipline. Silence preserved through fear of sabotage and exclusion. In that environment, a person can appear successful while living inside a cage that no one else can see. So when people ask why Yu Menglong has not spoken publicly, there are two answers that can coexist. One is legal caution. The other is trauma. Silence, after long-term coercion, can become a survival reflex. Some victims do not stay quiet because they have nothing to say. They stay quiet because they learned what happens when they speak. And yet the internet does what it always does. It turns whispers into movements. It turns fans into investigators. Screenshots become evidence in the court of public opinion. Leaked schedules, alleged internal notes, and blurry clips are examined frame by frame, as if truth can be extracted through sheer attention. There is a particular kind of desperation in that behavior. It is the desperation of people who suspect that official accountability may never arrive unless the public forces it into existence. But we must not confuse attention with certainty. Viral does not mean verified. Leaked does not mean authentic. Testimony does not mean conviction. At the same time, repetition does not happen for no reason. When multiple accounts describe the same architecture of control, the question becomes less about one sensational detail and more about what that detail indicates. The allegation is not that a star was embarrassed. The allegation is that an agency constructed an environment of surveillance and punishment in which humiliation served as a tool. A tool meant to enforce compliance. A tool meant to strip autonomy. A tool meant to prove, day after day, that the person you are is negotiable if someone else has enough leverage. And that brings us to the line we cannot avoid. What if this was never about humiliation, but about control? The public story of Yu Menglong is easy to summarize. A happy descent, carefully chosen roles, appearances that suggest confidence, discipline, and control. From the outside, his career looked linear, even inevitable, as if talent alone had carried him forward. But careers are not built in public. They are built in offices, rehearsal rooms, contracts, and closed-door conversations where the balance of power is rarely equal. According to accounts that would surface years later, the period between 2015 and 2016 marked a turning point. These were the years when Yu Menglong's visibility increased sharply. Projects succeeded. Fan bases expanded. With success came tighter management. With tighter management came rules that were never written down, but always enforced. At first, the controls were subtle. Schedules became inflexible. Social interactions were discouraged. Communication outside approved channels was questioned. These measures were framed as protection, discipline, professionalism. In the language of the industry, they sounded reasonable, necessary even. But control rarely announces itself as control. It introduces itself as care. Former insiders describe what they later recognized as obedience tests. Small requests that felt uncomfortable, but not yet outrageous. Tasks designed to measure how far someone would go without resistance, how quickly they would comply, how much of themselves they were willing to set aside in exchange for continued access to opportunity. Refusal, they say, was never met with immediate punishment. It was met with disappointment, with silence, with subtle reminders of how fragile a career can be when it depends on a handful of signatures and phone calls. In such an environment, fear does not need to shout. It only needs to wait. Psychologists who study coercive systems describe this process as conditioning, the gradual replacement of personal boundaries with external authority. Over time, the individual no longer asks whether something is acceptable. They ask whether it is expected, whether refusal is worth the cost. By 2017, multiple accounts claim the tests escalated. What had once been implied became explicit. What had once been framed as optional became mandatory. This is where the allegations of forced role-play enter the record. Not as isolated incidents, but as recurring practices embedded in a larger structure of dominance. The clothing, witnesses insist, was symbolic. It was not chosen for aesthetics or performance. It was chosen because it crossed a line, because it produced discomfort, because it reminded the subject that their image, their dignity, and their identity were assets owned by someone else. In systems like this, humiliation serves a precise function. It collapses resistance. Once a person has been made to participate in their own degradation, the psychological barrier to further compliance weakens. The individual learns that survival depends on adaptation, not defiance. Observers often ask why someone in this position does not simply leave. The answer lies in dependency. Careers in entertainment are not portable. Reputation is not owned by the individual. Contracts bind. Networks exclude. A single label can follow a person for years, quietly closing doors before they ever reach them. Several former trainees described the same internal conflict. They knew something was wrong. They felt the erosion of self-respect. Yet they also knew that speaking out could mean professional erasure. For someone whose identity has been fused with their career since adolescence, that threat carries existential weight. For Yu Menglong, the pressure was amplified by visibility. The higher the profile, the greater the leverage held by those who managed access to it. Success did not bring freedom. It increased the stakes. Public appearances during this period show no obvious signs of distress. That, too, is part of the design. Victims of long-term coercion often become experts in concealment. They learn to perform stability while living with constant anxiety. Smiles become reflexes. Silence becomes strategy. Behind the scenes, witnesses recall moments of breakdown, panic attacks dismissed as weakness, exhaustion reframed as ingratitude, emotional distress treated as a failure of discipline. In such spaces, vulnerability is not supported. It is exploited. What emerges from these accounts is not a story of a single act, but of a progression a slow tightening of control that redefined normality. By the time the most extreme demands appeared, resistance no longer felt like an option. It felt like self-destruction. And this is the most dangerous aspect of coercive systems. They do not rely on constant force. They rely on adaptation, on the victim learning to police themselves, on fear becoming internalized. By the end of this phase, insiders say, Yu Menglong was no longer navigating his career. He was navigating survival within it. And this was only the beginning. To understand what happened to Yu Menglong, it is necessary to step away from the individual and examine the structure that surrounded him. Because coercion, when it becomes routine, does not survive on cruelty alone. It survives on organization. Former employees and trainees described the agency not as a management company, but as a closed system. Authority flowed downward through clearly defined layers. Decisions were rarely explained. Orders were rarely questioned. Compliance was assumed, not requested. At the center of this structure was surveillance, not always technological, though phones and accounts were reportedly monitored. More often, it was social. Assistants reported behavior. Colleagues watched one another. Silence was interpreted as loyalty, curiosity as risk. Every aspect of daily life became subject to evaluation. What time someone woke up, who they spoke to, what they posted, how they dressed off camera. None of these details were insignificant. Together, they formed a map of control. Punishment did not always arrive as anger. It arrived as exclusion, a missed opportunity, a role reassigned without explanation, a sudden pause in promotions. In this environment, consequences were rarely documented, but always understood. This is where the role-play allegations take on a different meaning. Witnesses insist these acts were never spontaneous. They were scheduled, planned, sometimes observed by senior figures whose presence alone reinforced hierarchy. The purpose was not entertainment. It was demonstration. Demonstration of power. Demonstration of ownership. Demonstration that resistance was futile. Psychologists who study cult dynamics often note a similar pattern. Authority figures create rituals that separate insiders from outsiders. Acts that feel degrading to an observer become bonding mechanisms within the system. They remind participants that belonging comes at a cost. In the agency, humiliation allegedly served that function. Forced attire, servile tasks, public shaming during rehearsals or shoots. Each act reinforced a single message. You are here because we allow it. Multiple insiders described the same emotional atmosphere. Fear was constant but quiet. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The system itself did the work. People learned quickly what behaviors were rewarded and which were punished. What made the structure particularly effective was ambiguity. Rules were flexible. Enforcement was selective. This unpredictability kept everyone off balance. When consequences are inconsistent, anxiety replaces confidence. Individuals stop thinking long-term. They focus on immediate survival. Several former staff members admitted that they participated in enforcing these controls, not because they believed in them, but because refusal carried its own penalties. In hierarchical systems, coercion spreads downward. Victims become enforcers to avoid becoming targets. This diffusion of responsibility is critical. It allows those at the top to remain distant. Orders are implied, not stated. Accountability dissolves into procedure. For public figures like Yu Menglong, the cage was reinforced by image. The brand required perfection. Any sign of dissent could be reframed as unprofessionalism. Any complaint as ingratitude. The system thrived on that contradiction. The more successful the star appeared, the less credible their suffering seemed to outsiders. Fame became a shield for the institution, not the individual. And yet, cracks began to form. Not because the system weakened, but because it expanded too far. As more people were subjected to the same mechanisms, patterns emerged, stories aligned, timelines overlapped. Private experiences began to resemble one another with unsettling precision. This is the danger of institutional abuse. It scales, and when it scales, it leaves evidence. By the time the first testimonies surfaced, what shocked observers was not only the content of the allegations, but their consistency. Different voices, similar structures, identical language describing control, fear, and enforced obedience. What was once invisible now had a shape, and Yu Menglong was not the only one inside the cage. The moment that transforms a private abuse into a public reckoning is rarely dramatic at first. It begins quietly, with one person speaking, then another, then a third voice that sounds uncomfortably familiar. After the first testimony surfaced, it did not stand alone for long. Former trainees, anonymous staff members, interns who had long since left the industry. Their accounts began to appear in fragments across forums, private messages, and encrypted chats. Different people, different roles, but the same internal logic. They described an environment where obedience was measured, not assumed, where humiliation functioned as proof, where compliance was rewarded with access and refusal punished with disappearance. What had once been dismissed as rumors now carried structure. Several whistleblowers described identical procedures. Scheduled role-play sessions, clothing assigned not for performance, but for submission, tasks framed as loyalty tests, observers present not to intervene, but to watch, to confirm that hierarchy was intact. What made these accounts difficult to dismiss was not their emotional tone, but their specificity. Timelines overlapped, language repeated. Even the justifications used by supervisors appeared interchangeable. This was not improvisation. It was replication. Leaked materials soon followed. Internal schedules, alleged checklists, documents outlining expectations and penalties. While their authenticity remained under review, independent observers noted a disturbing alignment between the documents and the testimonies already circulating. The same phrases, the same escalation patterns, the same emphasis on control. At this stage, the story shifted again. Fans were no longer only reacting. They were investigating. Screenshots were archived. Appearances cross-referenced with dates. Patterns mapped. In the absence of official transparency, the public built its own provisional record. This phenomenon is not new. When institutions fail to account for themselves, audiences step into the vacuum. Sometimes recklessly, sometimes responsibly, always imperfectly, but driven by a shared suspicion that silence protects the wrong people. For Yu Menglong, this expansion of voices changed the narrative. The question was no longer whether one individual had been humiliated. It was whether an entire system had normalized coercion as a management strategy. Legal analysts observing the case noted a critical threshold. Isolated misconduct is difficult to prosecute. Systemic behavior is not. When multiple victims describe the same mechanisms, intent becomes easier to infer. Patterns establish liability. Psychological experts added another layer. Repeated humiliation across a group produces predictable outcomes. Anxiety, dissociation, learned helplessness. When individuals from unrelated backgrounds describe identical emotional responses, coincidence becomes unlikely. What is most revealing in these accounts is what they omit. There is little exaggeration, little dramatization. The language is restrained, matter of fact, as if the speakers are still cautious, still measuring the cost of honesty. That restraint itself suggests conditioning. Victims of long-term coercion often struggle to describe their experiences as abuse. They internalize blame. They minimize harm. They speak carefully, even when finally permitted to speak freely. As more testimonies emerged, industry insiders quietly acknowledged what many had long suspected, that such practices were not unheard of, that they were rare, but not unprecedented. That power, when left unchecked, tends to repeat its own methods. International media began drawing comparisons, not to equate cases, but to recognize patterns. Control disguised as mentorship, exploitation reframed as discipline, silence enforced through dependency. These structures transcend borders. Only their aesthetics change. By now, the narrative had outgrown any single agency or individual. It had become a case study in how abuse hides behind professionalism, how prestige shields perpetrators, how systems endure because they distribute responsibility until no one feels accountable. And this is where the danger lies. When everyone is partially responsible, no one feels fully guilty. When harm is procedural, it feels impersonal. When victims are isolated, their stories sound unbelievable. Until they are no longer isolated, the silence had broken, not all at once. Not completely, but enough to reveal the outline of something that had operated unseen for years. Once the silence broke, the system could no longer hide. When scandals reach this stage, Attention often shifts from facts to spectacle, but beneath the noise, there remains a quieter truth that is harder to confront. Systems like the one described in these testimonies do not collapse the moment they are exposed. They resist. They deny. They wait for fatigue to set in. For Yu Menglong, the cost of that resistance may already be irreversible. Psychological experts caution that long-term coercion leaves scars that are not always visible. Anxiety becomes chronic. Trust erodes. Identity fragments. Victims learn to perform wellness long after the threat has receded, because their bodies no longer recognize safety. Silence, in this context, is often misunderstood. To some observers, it looks like evasion. To others, weakness. But for those who have lived under sustained control, silence can be a final defense. Speaking is not merely an act of courage. It is an act that reopens risk. Legal consequences, retaliation, public scrutiny, the reliving of humiliation before an audience that may or may not believe. The agency at the center of these allegations has denied wrongdoing, offering statements that emphasize cooperation and caution against unverified claims. Such responses are familiar. Institutions rarely admit fault at the moment of greatest exposure. They rely instead on ambiguity, on time, on the hope that public attention will drift elsewhere. Yet something has changed in this case. The volume of voices, the consistency of detail, the documentation that continues to surface. Together, they have transformed a rumor into a record that refuses to disappear. Even without a courtroom verdict, the architecture of abuse has been outlined clearly enough to provoke global scrutiny. Legal analysts note that if the allegations are substantiated, the implications extend far beyond reputational damage. Psychological abuse, coercion, and forced compliance are increasingly recognized under labor and civil law. When patterns are established, accountability becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. More importantly, the conversation has expanded beyond legality. It has become a reckoning with how power operates in industries built on aspiration, where success is promised in exchange for obedience, where boundaries are negotiated under pressure, where exploitation hides behind the language of opportunity. International observers have drawn parallels to other entertainment sectors, not to dilute responsibility, but to recognize a shared vulnerability. Whenever careers depend on gatekeepers, the risk of abuse increases. Whenever silence is rewarded, harm multiplies. Fans, once dismissed as passive consumers, have become witnesses, archivists, analysts, advocates. Their involvement is imperfect, sometimes chaotic, but it reflects a growing refusal to accept ignorance as neutrality. In the absence of institutional transparency, they have insisted on memory. The human cost remains central. Behind every leaked document is a person who endured fear. Behind every testimony is someone who weighed the consequences of truth and chose to speak anyway. Recovery, experts remind us, is not a single event. It is a process measured in years, not headlines. This case may lead to reform, or it may fade into partial accountability and quiet settlements. History offers examples of both. What cannot be undone is the exposure itself. Once a system is seen, it cannot fully return to the shadows. And so the final question lingers. Heavier than any allegation, more enduring than any denial. The question is no longer what happened to Yu Menglong, but how many others are still trapped in silence.